For the first part of our presentation, we're going to ask that people stay on mute, but please use the Whova chat to tell us your name, your pronouns, if you feel comfortable sharing. If you work at an institution, you can share it, your role at that institution, if you'd like, and what brought you here this morning. We'll be checking the Whova chat throughout and look forward to seeing where all of you are. Okay, Scarlett, can I officially kick off?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Black Art Matters Festivals, queer fashion shows, community luncheons, oh my, cultivating the College Art Museum as a site for radical inclusion. We're so happy to be with you this morning. Thank you for taking time to be with us as well. We're going just to roadmap our morning. We're going to spend the first 5 minutes doing some intros, grounding statements, community agreements, and going over our goals for the session. We're going to then invite you to do a few minutes of personal reflection, just quietly on your own to all get in the same headspace. From 11 to 11:30, we're going to share some case studies and an introduction to and dreaming for radical inclusion. Then we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and go into breakout rooms for you to apply and practice what radical inclusion might look like in your institutions. And then we're going to spend the last 15 minutes or so collective troubleshooting and doing a share out and doing some Q&A. So with that, whenever you see these little pink thought bubbles at the top of our slides, please note that those are opportunities for you to really reply in the Whova chat. So we invite you to share your name, institution, role, location, and pronouns if you'd like, and feel free to let us know what made you attend this session this morning. My name is Daniela Medeo. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College. I have a dual role there at the Mead. I do all of our communications and marketing, and that's sort of one department. And then the other half, or the other job that I have, is public programming, which is housed under the education department at the Mead. And in that role, I am so grateful and privileged to be able to work with amazing campus partners, including my co-panelists this morning. And hopefully the goal of our program is to transform the museum as into a site of community engagement and aspirationally radical inclusion. So thank you to my co-panelists for being here, and I'll turn it over to you both for intros as well.
Of course. Thank you, Danielle. Hi, everyone. My name is Jan Martin. I use any vowel for my first name. My intimates call me JT as well. They, them pronouns for me. And I'm currently the director of the Queer Resource Center at Amherst College. And basically what I do, I support LGBTQ students and all of their complicated, multiplicated identities through co-curricular programming, direct student supervision and development, as well as consultation for the institution on workshops, trainings, policy reform. I have the tremendous privilege to work collectively with my colleagues as part of the Resource Center's team. So that's all the folks in the Resource Centers that are identity-based, kind of working to do larger social justice education across campus. And anyway, I'll let my my colleague introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ebony Rafus Brenning. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm the director of the Multicultural Resource Center. I, too, am part of the Resource Center team. I direct one of 5 centers in the team, and other centers include the Women and Gender Center, the Center for International Student Engagement, and the Center for Diversity and Leadership. And so together with those centers and the QRC, we work to support students with marginalized identities and non-traditional students, first year low-income students, et cetera, et cetera. In the MRC, I specifically work to support students who identify as people of color or who have racially marginalized identities, and we do that through advocacy, resource sharing, holding space for affinity groups, holding support groups, and doing programming. So I will share my screen. Oh, I don't need to. Okay, great. So we wanted to start today with land acknowledgement. We like to acknowledge that Amherst College, where we all work, stands on Nonotuck land. We'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We recognize that without their thoughtful stewardship of the land we occupy, we wouldn't be able to have this dialogue today. We also want to recognize that these types of land acknowledgements, don't repair the painful history of genocide, re-education, forced removal from the territory that a lot of our Indigenous populations faced. But we want to continue to speak the names of the Indigenous communities, and we encourage you to all reflect on these contexts and learn more. There are websites that you can find where you can research who were the first stewards of the lands that you occupy and learn a little bit more about those Indigenous nations.
We'd also like to share a labor acknowledgement and thank all of those whose work is often made invisible, but whose work is integral to the programs that we're going to share in this presentation and who are actually making the presentation possible. So that includes our artist partners, our colleagues, our campus partners, our student staff and interns, as well as the NEMA organizers. And Scarlett, our moderator this morning, thank you for being here and setting this up for us. And what other unseen labor, maybe like the HUVA organizers and the folks who put together that platform. So a lot of hands go into making these things happen, and we want to just say thank you for that.
So now, before we kind of jump into the content of our time together, we want to just create some space to set some expectations with each other. So just thinking back on what our agenda was and what we're going to cover this morning, we set up these particular expectations, and we'll invite you all to kind of add or modify in the UVA chat as well, in that little pink chat box thing reminder. So I'll just go through these just so we have a shared understanding. So what stays here, what's said here stays, what's learned here leaves. Oftentimes in our conversations, we'll be sharing intimate conversations about identity and power and workplace and navigating barriers and challenges. And so we want to make sure that we take the lessons from those stories that are shared by our future partners in our activity later today, or stuff that my colleagues and I will be sharing. Leave the specifics, take the lesson. Stay curious and open to new ideas. Some of what we're sharing might be new to you, and that's okay. That's totally fine. That's why you're here, right? And we just want to encourage you all to keep an open mind and open heart as you're kind of accepting and hearing and listening to what we have to say. Practice active listening. This is super important. Again, when we enter the activity phase of our workshop, we want to encourage you all to stay present and to really listen to what someone else has to say, not necessarily listen to respond. And that includes staying quiet, not necessarily offering verbal or nonverbal cues or affirmation, just really listening to what someone has to say. Use I statements, super important to make sure that we're not generalizing our own understandings or experiences to be universal, right? So using phrases like, for my understanding, or for my experience, for my memory, right? I understand this as this, or I've come to know this as this, right? Impact versus intent. We were all entering this space from different places, but I hope that we can assume there's some good intent in the room, that we are colleagues or at least collegial, and that sometimes what we say is harmful, right? And we might not know it to be, right? But it doesn't take away the impact of harm from those around us. And we have to hold ourselves responsible and accountable to the harm we create and the impact we create. Expect and lean into discomfort, kind of connected to that staying open and curious. Some things that we share or talk about might elicit some discomfort in you, and we're going to ask you, instead of shying away from that discomfort, lean into it, investigate. Why am I feeling uncomfortable about this? Or what about what I'm seeing or hearing is making me uncomfortable? And oftentimes that's the place where we get to learn and grow the most, is those places of discomfort. This is important. I know you all have been on Zoom for pretty much all week for this conference, and/or for work, and/or for life. I know I'm currently working in Zoom University. It's like Zoom 12 hours a day. So it's important to practice self-care. So at any point, if you need to turn your screen off, take a breather, want to just listen, have to use the restroom, grab water, any of those things, please make sure you're empowering yourself to do so. Be aware of judgments and assumptions. I kind of already named this, but just make mark. We're socialized to assume and to judge and to project our own understandings onto others in other situations. But make note of when you're doing that. and monitor your space and time. We'll do this as your facilitators for this time, but when we do breakouts, we'll encourage you to make sure you're self-monitoring how much time you're sharing, each of you are sharing into a space. But yeah, so those are community agreements. Again, for folks at this point, all who agree, please just post in the UVA chat saying that you agree to these expectations. And again, we welcome at any point for folks to add and or modify any of these agreements via the chat as well.
So before we dive in, we wanted to offer 5 minutes of critical self-reflection. So the larger question we want you to be thinking about is, what can radical inclusion look like for you and your work? And within that, you may think about, where do you have agency or power within your institution or community? What's your spheres of influence? And where can you tweak the work you're already doing to create space for inclusion? If you have time, we invite you to think about where you might have the ability to facilitate or advocate for partnerships with marginalized communities within your institution or within your community. You can do this reflection just in your head. You can write things on a Post-it note or a notebook. You can write in the chat if you feel so moved. But these reflections are just personal reflections. They won't be shared out. We just want to give you an opportunity to think about where you are and where your institution is in terms of radical inclusion. So I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and we'll start now.
For anyone who might have come into the room late, this is a silent reflection. So please feel free to read the questions on the screen, take some notes, and think quietly, and we'll jump back into the presentation shortly.
Okay, I just want to give folks a 1-minute warning. 1 more minute to reflect. Okay, write down your last thought and let's come back together. Thank you for taking the time to do that. And please feel free to return to those thoughts or those notes that you've written down throughout this presentation or workshop. We would like to introduce to you radical inclusion and our thoughts on how we can dream for radical inclusion and what that looks like to us and our institution. And we like to provide you with our definition of what radical inclusion is.
Right. Not that this is necessarily the definition, but these are things that we were workshopping and operating from. So these are kind of two-pronged. So one, we thought of radical inclusion as being the re-centering of historically and presently marginalized identities and decision-making and operations within an organization or institution with self-articulated goals and processes, right? Or the reallocating or allocating of power resources from institution directly to marginalized communities the institution is aiming to serve. And so, we'll move into our case studies now. So, how does this show up on our campus? How does this show up at the Mead? And we're going to talk about 3 major programs that we have collaborated on. So specifically Red Eye, Black Tie, Black Arts Matters Festival, and a gender-affirming clothing swap and fashion show. And so I'll let my colleagues take it from here.
Thanks, Jen. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so we have our program case studies, and these programs don't do radical inclusion perfectly. And we don't mean to imply that at all, but this is kind of as close as we've gotten. And there's always room for improvement. So we're going to share some of our progress with these programs. And it's not to say that programs are the only place to do radical inclusion. It can show up elsewhere in your work. It can show up in exhibitions. It can show up in acquisitions. It can show up in so many places. But this is kind of our area of expertise here. So I'm going to start with Red Eye, Black Tie. When I started at the Mead 4 years ago, I took a listening tour of the campus and asked people what they do, what they were passionate about, and what they needed, and what they wanted to see the museum do for them. And what I heard was a community need for art by makers who held marginalized identities, and the need for that art to show up in non-museum spaces. So I was really excited. I was like, oh, great. We're going to take this collection of art that we actually don't have and put it in spaces outside the museum. And I went back to my team and I said, how are we going to make this happen? And what I ended up hearing was actually a lot of no's. We had barriers. We couldn't actually set up a lending program. The works that we had in our collection wouldn't have been suitable for the lending program that we couldn't actually create anyway. I didn't really have any power or say over acquisitions or exhibitions or having art making processes or food in our galleries. There were just a lot of no's, like things I couldn't do. I'm happy to say that there's been a lot of progress at the Mead in the last 4 years. So I don't mean to say that we're just a no place, but when I started, I was hearing a lot of no's, and we've made a lot of progress since then. But at the time, there were a few yeses. So I could do a live art making event or an art making event as long as it took place outside. I could do artist workshops. Okay. I could do this thing maybe in the form of a commission, which I'll tease out a little bit later. I knew I could do events, and I knew I could use partner sites. So I had that percolating as I kept that goal in mind of bringing art created by marginalized artists who held marginalized identities into non-museum spaces. That was the lofty goal. And I knew it was impossible right away. But in the meantime, I decided that I should get to know my community partners a little bit more. So I started showing up to their programs, getting to know them, getting to know their mission, their spaces, their needs outside of this request for art. And I tried to plug into what they were already doing to find ways to partner. So we started small with artist lunches. I noticed by showing up to the Resource Center team events that there was always a lunch. There was always a lunch, there was always a breakfast, there was always dinner, there was always a tea time, there's always some kind of gathering with food where students came together. And most museums have some kind of an artist lecture series or a scholar lecture series, and the Mead certainly had an artist lecture series. And I decided to start calling up my friends in the Resource Center team, my would-be partners, and say, we're bringing an artist who, hey Jan, we're bringing a queer artist to campus who happens to really lean on their identity in the creation of their work. Can we bring them into the QRC for lunch with students so that they can have an informal conversation? And the answer was always a resounding yes. And it's like, okay, we're going to split the cost of some sandwiches, and we're going to have people together. We're going to order pizza and give students a chance to connect with artists. That grew. The artist lunches became a real counterpoint to our lecture series, where students had the opportunity to informally engage with artists and learn about careers in the art world and what that meant for people with particular identities in a way that was really, really meaningful. And it's now a staple. It's now a staple whenever we bring an artist to campus. We try to also do a lunch component or an affinity program with one of the Resource Center teams. And we kept building a relationship of trust with the goal of future collaboration. So I couldn't bring art into space, but we can bring a physical artist and chat. So that was really a step one. The step two is really what Red Eye Black Tie became, which was a program in which I was able to commission contemporary artists to create site-specific works of art in collaboration with our campus partners for their spaces. This took place in the form of planning calls and I guess it was before Zoom, it was like Skype sessions, where we pulled together a site team of students and staff who used this space, and they had calls with artists to figure out what would work well for them in their space. Should it be a sculpture? Should it be a print? Should it be a painting? And then we invited those artists to campus for a live art making event, which happened in, the tent outside the Mead, which we rebranded as the Makerspace, because I also have a marketing hat on. And we had these artists come together and create work over what started as a full 24-hour period and then became a day-long event just during working hours. But they made work in tandem with the students, staff, and community members who used the sites, which was really, really meaningful because it created a sense of ownership and personal investment in the works that were created. It was like a works of art that were created like for us, by us, with us, in tandem. It was a really, really beautiful thing. And the negotiation that I had to make for the Mead was that we commissioned the artwork, but we didn't acquire it. So if we had acquired it, we would have had to lend it out, and we couldn't lend, right? So we had to go back to that initial no, but we could commission it and gift it. We could just give it to the site as to own and interpret and steward and maintain, which is how this program happens and how it works. And And of course, the Mead and my colleagues are all available to provide support and guidance if you want to talk about hanging, if you want to talk about interpretation. But really, the work lives in the centers. So I'm going to show a few pictures. So this is our list of site partners and artists. I just wanted to name them and have them here, and we can share the slides with you so you can look at them later. But this is our 24-hour, the first iteration was a 24-hour live art making. So this is the Mead at night. We had a gelato truck and an espresso bar. We had a live DJ. This is one of our artists who did work for the Queer Resource Center and a Queer Is series where people wrote in and participated in the printmaking process. We had a mingle session for artists to meet students with food and music in the galleries. Here's some of that making taking place. Here's the artist in the QRC with Jan seeing the site and installing her work. Here's an artist who was doing work for the MRC, and he actually went down to the site to see what colors he needed to include and involve students in that process. Rachel Eng is making art for our Science Center, and here's the installation process, which involved students and faculty as well as the artist. And here, of course, is one of our signature artist lunches in the campus dining hall, artists, students, staff, faculty all together, learning from one another. I'm running a little short on time, but I just want to share a few takeaways from that program, which hopefully will inspire you and make it a little bit less scary to embark on something like this. You have to show up for your would-be partners. You have to meet folks wherever they're at and start building relationships and building trust. Ask them what they need and what they want and listen. And then you kind of got to find a way to deliver, right? And you may not be able to do it all at first, but you can start in small steps. You can find some creative workarounds. There's always a yes. I promise there's a yes buried in all the no's. It can be frustrating to hear them, but it's there, it's somewhere. You just have to shift your lens sometimes. So don't be limited by site restrictions. Tents, you can rebrand them as maker spaces. You can rebuild parking lots as partner sites, but they're great for activities that aren't permitted within your museum spaces. Don't be limited by what's in your collection. You can commission work, you can collaborate to create new work, and you can cede ownership to make things happen. That was really powerful, and I haven't seen a museum do that so far, and I found it to be an effective strategy. So don't forget that you can always cede ownership. Find external partners and funders to support your vision. Red Eye Black Tie is about a $20,000 program, and I had $3,000 from the Mead to make this happen. Happy to discuss budget and fundraising separately with anyone who wants to learn more about that. But you have to be able to find people who can buy into your vision and help you make it happen. Be a partner, not just a venue. So that means sharing labor, space, funding, and other resources to make the projects happen. If you don't have the funds, you can collaborate with partners to fundraise together because you're each going to bring in your own constituents, donors, and stakeholders. And finally, sharing project ownership means sharing risk, failure, and successes, which honestly makes it a lot less scary, and the rewards are a lot more beautiful, in my opinion. So thanks for listening to Red Eye Black Tie, and we're going to hear a little bit from Ebony next. And Ebony, do you want to take over screen share?
I'm sorry, I realized I was muted. Okay, can folks see this?
No.
Can folks see that? I'm sorry. Believe it or not, we did practice that. So let's try this again. Okay, Danielle, would you mind us just using your screen so we don't lose more time? Apologize, folks.
Not at all.
Okay, and I'll just give you some verbal cues as to when I would like for you to move forward in your on the screen. Okay, so the Black Arts Matters Festival. The Black Arts Matters Festival, or BAM, was created by a student, Zoe Akoto, who noticed that there was a lack of Black art on campus. She looked around and she didn't see herself represented in the art on campus. And so she was inspired to create an art festival that centered around Black student artists. She first launched BAM in February of 2018 in a public space in one of Amherst College's residence halls. It was a dorm called Greenway, and she just reserved a space, had her friends and herself created some artwork and displayed it. Danielle heard about this event while she was attending another event in the Multicultural Resource Center, or the MRC. There was an event happening and she happened to attend. She was lingering after the event, talking to students, hanging out with them in their space, and she heard about the BAM Festival. And so she approached Zoe and offered her support. She said, hey, next year, why don't we do this in the Mead? Let's do this in the Amherst College Art Museum. And Zoe said, really? We can do that? That's a possibility. And Danielle said, yes, of course. The museum is for you. And so in 2019, BAM was produced by students in partnership with the Mead Art Museum. It included paintings and sculptures and musical performances and spoken word performances, and of course, lots and lots of food. So in 2020, Zoe Akoto was studying abroad in France, and I started as a director of the MRC. And so after speaking with Zoe through email, I took the lead in partnering with Danielle to make sure that the show went on. We wanted to make sure that BAM didn't fall through the cracks just because the person who conceived of it was not physically around. So if we move on to the first slide, this is the organizers of BAM 2019. We had student organizers who helped with the marketing and helped send out a call for artwork and also emceed the event. The next slide shows some marketing that we used for BAM 2019. If you can move on to the next one. And then the next one is a picture of our MC for the 2020 iteration of BAM, Sade Green. She was one of the original organizers in 2019, and then Zoe's absence became our MC. She was interviewed by our college radio station, and in preparation for that, she sat down with Danielle to go over talking points. And so Danielle, of course, is the museum professional. She might have years of experience or knowledge, but instead of taking forefront and doing the interview herself, she and I believed that it was important that we had a student MC and a student do the interviews, because this was created out of a need that a student saw to feel represented on our college campus. And so instead of just doing the interview herself, she prepped Sade, a Black student artist, to do the interview. So the next slide shows a dance performance that happened in one of the galleries. Yes, dance can happen in the museum, in the galleries. The next photo shows, sorry, Danielle, to make you keep switching these, a moment within the Black Arts Festival in 2020 where community members connected with students. What I love about this picture is that these two women met for the first time at the Black Arts Matters Festival, and they were participating in the event together, felt a connection. The older woman, the elder in the community, had a poem she wanted performed at the open mic, but didn't feel comfortable performing it herself. So she asked a student, Trinity Baker, to do that for her. And so here we have like intergenerational connection, which I'd love to see. The next photo is some clay sculptures and jewelry that was created by a community member that was displayed. And that was displayed in the same room as the next photo, which is of student art, paintings, and that is being displayed alongside some art from some established artists. So next to student paintings, we have a quilt by Christopher Meyer that had, an artist talk a couple of days before. And so they're being displayed alongside each other. Of course, we had food and open mic. And then the next photo is an open mic participant sharing a poem. Musical performances were included. And there's a picture of us as organizers, myself, Danielle, and Sade. A few takeaways from the Black Arts Festival is to reach out to others who are doing the work you want to be doing, and ask how you can offer support, show up for them and meet them where they are, be willing to start small, yet dream big. As I mentioned before, Danielle was in the Multicultural Resource Center when she heard about this event. She went to the spaces where the students were. She supported them in their other endeavors. And she already had a relationship with those students because of her willingness to meet them where they are and to hang out where they're hanging out. And so she saw something that she thought was worthwhile, and she offered her support. Be open and curious about the type of art that museums can hold. What I love about this event is that it shows that museums don't have to just be sites for paintings and sketches and sculpture. It can also be a site for open mics and dance performances and concerts. We did temporary pop-up installations. So we were not limited by what was in our permanent collection. We sourced art from community members and from students and really made a dynamic event where we had permanent collections and installed art standing alongside pop-up installations and art from community members, art from students and amateurs. And then I will just say this really quickly, because I know that Danielle already touched upon it a little bit, but yes, there's a difference between being a site or a venue for an event and being a true partner. And that means sharing labor and space and funding and resources to make those projects happen. And for the sake of time, I'm going to end there. But of course, if you have other questions about Black Art Matters, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Turn it over to Jan.
Alrighty, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our gender-affirming clothing swap and fashion show. So this is a project that was driven around student conversation. So I had a student staff member who approached me being like, hey, for my capstone, as a side, my seniors or folks who do at least 3 years in the center do some sort of capstone project. Back to the main story here. I want to do something around identity and fashion, specifically transness in fashion, right? Being that like so many of us who are trans and non-binary use fashion as a way to actuate our gender, right? To find self-agency and determination in our gender identities. And so I was like, absolutely. And immediately what came to mind was working with Danielle. And part of that was, as Danielle had shared before, like these other kind of programs or relationships we had been building. And I think part of it was like, oh, it'd be so amazing, like to do something like fashion is art, like we can, maybe we can see what, what we, there might be in the collection of the Mead and or maybe we can use context to show pieces. There was particular talk of Alexander McQueen and maybe some other folks. Anyway, because of logistics and money, we ended up doing something that was a little bit more humble and community oriented, being instead of featuring either particular like art, particular fashion or a particular fashion designer, we were like, why don't we create space for our community to do that, like to actually do the work of gender self-determination and lower the bar to access to incredible clothes. And so what we embarked on was this really intensive collaborative that included not only the day of program, but weeks and months of clothing collection from our community, as well as a curricular trip to New York City that included purchasing from various community thrift stores, including Housing Works in various locations across the city, but also trips to the Lesbian History Archive with a private tour of the archive, and as well as a stop at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art to kind of get inspired. And a part of the way we framed this the show was in terms of dimensionism. That was the spring show at the Mead that year. And so we were looking at ways and intersections of art and science and fashion. And so we did that with those students, with a cohort of students who were working on the program. And the end point was an incredible space and program. So we had a pop-up free store in the Rothross room where students and community members from across the 5 college community could come in and swap out various clothing from the various collections and donate clothes and pick up binders and packers and gaffs, which are resources that the QRC offers, and try them on and take pictures and be joyous and sign up potentially to partake in what was like the crown jewel of the evening, which was the runway show. And we had various foods and a full runway and production and lights and a DJ and an MC. And at a certain point, folks came back, got dressed, pampered, helping each other, exploring their gender, actuating truer forms of their gender, and then got to actually show that to the world, show that into our community. It was really magical. So I'll show you a few pictures from both the first few are from the Rothross room and kind of lead up to the runway show. These are various students, staff, faculty, all participated, mostly from Amherst. We had a few folks from the 5 colleges. Here's yours truly and Danielle doing a little introduction to the program, announcing our partnership and how the runway show is going to happen. And here are some images from the runway show itself. I will name that these are, so these pictures are done by Maria Stencil, who's the college photographer, just to give credit, again, thinking about labor acknowledgement. Here we are, some more pictures. And this is a really special picture, and I will name that. So yes, I talked about engagement across the 5 colleges, but which is the various colleges in our area here in Western Mass, but it also engaged folks in the community. And so this is a youth who participated, who was inspired to be part of the evening in the runway show. And I'll speak a little bit to that too, about the impacts we have and that we don't necessarily acknowledge or see or always they're thinking about from our work. And here's everyone who participated. Great little shot. And yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about these takeaways. Like, what are some of the kind of big picture things? And I think what made this program so successful is that we really were working to highlight, support, and amplify community-based leadership, right? So this started with a kernel, an idea from a student, but that was reflected in the student community and conversation, which is both our entities, the Mead and the QRC serve, right? And it's important that when you're doing so, you're not doing on behalf of, but truly working and collaborating with. When you're working, no matter what context you're in, when you're working with marginalized folk. It's the way in which you're able to actually do something that's appropriate and reflective and impactful, that people are going to want to show up to and participate in. But this is all based on authentic relationships. I can't underscore this enough. And I think that's a through line between all 3 of these case studies. Like, there are relationships being built that have been being built for a long time, and that Danielle and the Mead were doing with the resource centers and with our marginalized students communities on campus. And this has a profound impact, right, on not just like the relationships in between individuals, but also the perception and reception of the entities that are working with the community. So, like, for example, the MRC and the QRC in working with the Mead, right, was like Mead seeing as this academic place on campus, like, oh, the QRC is doing something a little bit outside of just your standard student engagement, right? And for the Mead, it was like, oh, wow, you're working directly with our students, right? And so it created this really great blend of the co-curricular, the curricular, the student engagement. Anyway,
Jan, check your sound.
Sure. You can't hear me?
I think you're good now.
Oh, okay. All right, cool, thanks. Let me know, I also tend to talk fast too, so if I'm talking too fast, let me know in the chat too. And the last piece I will name, it's important no matter who you're working with to compensate people for their time and their labor. Like, by happenstance of our context, like, all the folks involved in this planning process were compensated, even the students, because the students were working directly for this resource centers and or specifically the QRC and or the Mead, right? So I think that it's important to acknowledge that. The second big takeaway I started acknowledging this in my remarks, but you have to acknowledge the impact of the work can be multiplistic, right? It's not necessarily the intended goal and engagement in, that you have from the outset. It could be so many other ways in which this lives, right? And this happens, of course, like across multiple modalities and relationships. like, and I acknowledged and talked about like the staff-student dynamic, the impact it has on the entities in part of our community, on the student community, and I, kind of named the way in which this even had larger impact outside directly our campus community, and where folks from outside our community were participating, but also on the individual, right? I think one of the most magical moments, I think, for me in this program was in that Rotheraus room, seeing majority trans and non-binary students, queer students, most of them people of color, like actually like living in their truth, and the kind of energy, the shining of that, the energy of that was really magical and healing and beautiful. And for me, thinking about liberation dreams, that's what I live for, right, in the work. And so I think all of that is true, right? And again, kind of complicating these like false like divisions between what type of labor and work happens in a college campus community, right? Between the curricular and the co-curricular, or the student support and consult, like all of that, right? Kind of blending that together and thinking about that holistically in support of students, both academic and personal growth. And I want to highlight the both seen and unseen, and measurable and measurable. This is important to highlight for anyone who does assessment of your work, for whatever reason. Like when you're working with marginalized communities, specifically communities that don't necessarily have large numbers within your community, like your context, right? It's not necessarily about numbers of engagement, right? I still think we had good engagement in Danielle. I think we probably had 150 people between the audience and the participants in the show, but right, it's about the quality of that engagement. It's about in the afterlife of that, right? People talked about this program for weeks after, and it was like assumed that it would be an annual tradition, right? Unfortunately, COVID got in the way of that, but here we are. And the last piece I want to highlight here, museums have a responsibility to name and cultural and aesthetic standards, right? And so like when we're thinking about marketing marginalized group, whether it's folks like folks of color, whether it's queer and trans folks, whether like whoever, right? Like in partnership with communities on their own, naming and creating space for marginalized ways of being, of showing, of doing, right, is integral in the kind of imagining, in my understanding or my thoughts of imagining radical inclusion. Yeah, so I'll leave that there. We're gonna move into a little bit of break. I know folks might have questions and stuff. We'll hold time for the end, but I want to give you all some time to stretch, look around, use your body, get to the bathroom, get a snack, drink some water. So we'll clock back in here at 11:34. All right. Thank you all.
In the meantime, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. We'll use this time to respond. We've been trying to respond as we go, but we'll use this time to respond as well. So there's a great question. I'm just gonna, in the 1 minute of our break, there was a really great question about virtual engagement and partnerships. Yes, I briefly mentioned in the chat, a lot of what we're doing is going to translate to Zoom. So we are gonna do a Black Art Matters Festival over Zoom. Ebony and I have already had a planning meeting. We're in the process of getting that planned for early March. So if you wanna attend, please just like, you can DM me and I can add you to our email listserv, or you can follow us on our social media platforms so you can tune into those things. Zoom makes it possible for more people to attend, which is great. And we did do a series of artist talks, and we set up artist lunches over Zoom. It's not quite the same, but there was still a really, really wonderful connection. We had Jess Van do an artist talk at the Mead, and he did a luncheon at the QRC, which was a small attendance, but really meaningful impact for those who were there. So definitely need those opportunities for connecting and engaging more than ever. As people are feeling more and more isolated, we need to maintain that. And it's tough, but we're trying. I'm lucky to have really great partners on this team here and then elsewhere on the college who help make that happen too.
Follow-up question is, have we seen a lot of Zoom and virtual fatigue from our audience? I think that yes, Zoom fatigue is real. That means in terms of classes and in programming and events and audiences, that's true. I think that our audience might not be as big as they have in the past or what we might have if we were in person. And so one of the ways in which we are trying to mitigate that is spreading things out over time. So to speak about Black Art Matters, instead of having, normally it's like a 3-hour festival, 4-hour festival. Instead of doing something like that, we are doing an event with Black alumni, talking about arts festival that happened in the 70s. It's going to be called Black Art Matters Then and Now. And so that'll be an hour program. Then a week later, we'll have the Black Arts Festival, which will be maybe an hour to an hour and a half program. Throughout the month of February, we're going to be having like a social media campaign where we're going to be sharing art via Instagram and highlighting artists. So instead of condensing something that would normally be like just a 3-hour program in person, we're trying to spread out the programming. So it's an hour here and an hour there to kind of combat the Zoom fatigue. So I would say that our partnerships haven't really changed, but definitely our strategies for our programming has had to change because of the virtual setting.
Yeah, I echo all of that. All right, I think it's ready for us to get started, right? Okay, great. So, all right, well, we're gonna click back in. So our chunk of the remainder of our time, we're gonna move into some activity. So our Scarlett is still in here, I hope, who will help us kind of coordinate into breakout rooms. So we're gonna move you all into pairs randomly. Me and my colleagues are not going to participate in these pairs. We're going to have our own conversation, but for all of you here, we're going to move into pairs, and we're going to ask you to kind of do a classic pair share with each person taking 2.5 minutes to kind of answer these first 2 questions on your screen. So where do you work? What do you do? And what does radical inclusion mean to you? Right. And so after both partners share, you're going to move into apply and practice brainstorm, right? And so that's what these final 4 questions here. And we're going to ask you to self-moderate, give each other about equal airtime, about 10 minutes each. We're going to ask you to go work through where do you have power and agency within your institution? What decisions do you make regularly? Who listens? Where can you make space for radical inclusion in your work? Which organizations or groups exist in your community, et cetera, et cetera. So I dropped the questions for all of these in the UVA chat. And if folks can't see that, please let us know on the chat. We'll find a way to get them to you. But at this point, I'll have the breakout rooms open, and I welcome and hope you all have really rich conversation. We will ask you all to share, a few folks to share out kind of what came up in their conversation at the end.
And we'll do some collective troubleshooting. So if you're running into barriers, that'll be a time for you to ask questions, and we'll try to help figure out ways to circumnavigate them together. Have fun, everyone. See you in about 25 minutes. It's great to see you all. Welcome back. Do we have everyone back?
Not yet.
Okay.
15 more seconds.
As our co-attendees return, We have some share out questions, which if you feel comfortable, we'd love to hear from you. You can raise your hand to respond verbally over the Zoom, or you can respond in the chat. Like, let's try to make as much use of that as we can because we want to hear from as many people as possible. But please raise your hand if you'd like to share some key takeaways that may have come up in your conversation. If you have like roadblocks to some of the stuff that we're talking about and you want to troubleshoot together, feel free to share those and we can all weigh in the chat and the presenters can try to help answer stuff over Zoom. And then if you have questions for us, of course, we have about 15 minutes to try to answer them. So,
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but to be clear, when we say raise your hand, we mean use the option to raise your hand through Zoom. Click the little button that'll put a little blue hand on your square so that we can see everyone.
any insights that folks want to share? Okay, I see. Handing it over to Riza.
Hi there. I had a really productive session with Star from the Abbey Museum. Thank you, Star. So a lot of what we talked about was having a lot of agency versus very little agency in our institutions, in sort of the ways we can cede power and also advocate for ourselves. And we also talked a lot about reaching out to community partners in order to center those voices and feel like the work isn't so terribly overwhelming when we have all of these community partners to ally with.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think as it came up in the presentations, for sure, teaming up makes it less scary and you're able to assemble agency. You're able to build it. When it's not just your ask, when it's our ask. When it's at a college art museum, for me, it was really useful to be able to go to my colleagues and say, this is a student request and we're here to serve our students as one of our many constituencies, but that seems to be one that gains a lot of traction at Amherst College. So that was one strategy that kind of worked for me. And it wasn't really, it was me becoming a vessel for the student request. I didn't necessarily feel like I had power agency. I got a lot of no's, right? It was like, well, I don't want this, but I'm hearing that this is what students want and is a way of amplifying that request. And because we have to be, or we want to be responsive to this particular group, that was one thing that worked. So one thing that you might try is like identifying your key constituents and advocating on their behalf. So maybe it's a board member. It's like, oh, I talked about this with a board member and they were so excited. They really want to see us do X, Y, or Z, or a faculty member, or, you know, whomever your like key constituents are, finding ways to amplify a request from them, even if you're planting the seeds, could be one strategy. Danielle, do you want to share from your breakout group?
Sure. Hi. So we talked a little bit about, there was 3 of us. So we tried to cover a lot of ground based on where people were coming from, but we talked a lot about the breadth of what counts as radical inclusion, right? Like it can be board diversity, and it can be like accessibility to your building, and it can be all these different things, and it can be overwhelming to try and tackle everything at once. And so it's important to try and like pick stuff and make a plan to keep getting better. We also talked about like top-down and bottom-up inclusion. So like board diversification, leadership diversification, and then also like reaching out to the community to see what they want and how to include them in your institution, and how like these are like 2 different strategies that that need to happen like in tandem, basically. And also about trying to get buy-in for projects that like maybe a hard lift, to convince somebody, and we talked about partnering with people, like other institutions or scholars or other places in your community, to try to sort of like back it both with numbers and with research, like depending on what everybody's strengths and weaknesses are, to try and create, you know, a deeper interest in the community that convinces whoever has to okay something that this is worth doing.
Thank you so much for sharing. Anne, do you want to share some?
I'd love to. Thank you so much. First of all, what a random and awesome connection. My lovely partner, we both happen to be from Manchester, New Hampshire. What are the odds of that? So I look forward to developing our in-person connection when we can do that. Thank you for bringing us together as a small community. My partner just had so many ethics. It just was so inspiring to me. Some of the things she said were, she talked about this allegiance to knowledge and not politics. And I was like, really? What could that look like? And it was, you know, this idea of getting stories from the community, knowing your neighborhood, getting out there. And I just was so jazzed by this conversation, Christine, and really recognizing that we're not going to we don't want to own your history or tell your history. We can't do that as a historic site. But we'll present, you know, we're happy to have you share that. And then we might have another perspective, and the evidence, there may be different and conflicting perspectives. There may not be a match, but isn't that quite interesting, and not having the match? So I thought that was just really powerful. One of the things that was a real shift for me was when I was talking about work for an art museum and thinking about ceding authority and expertise, letting go. It's just hard, and we all have to work on it. And, you know, Christine was like, well, sharing, it's really sharing expertise. And, you know, I know this, but it was like, yeah, this isn't about letting go. This is about the beauty of quilting it together. So in the language and conversations we had, it was just very beautiful, and I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for sharing that. If anyone else has any insights from your groups and you'd like to raise your hand, please feel free. If you have any questions for us on the panel, we're also happy to answer them now. You can ask them out loud by raising your Zoom hand, or you can put them in the chat if you feel more comfortable. The chat is in the Whova platform. So earlier in the conference, or earlier in our presentation, folks in the chat were asking about ceding ownership. And I think there are a lot of ways to do that, but I think the first step is acknowledging that as a museum, like maybe you don't actually have the right to own anything, right? And that came up in one of our comments about owning histories, narratives, a lot of times the works that are in our collections. So I think it helps to have conversations as a staff around those kind of issues, and knowing what your purpose is, and that you're there to serve your audiences. And so many museums are echoing the refrain of, we need to diversify our programming, we need to be more inclusive. Well, there are ways to do that would mean giving those folks platforms and agency and ownership of your space. Sorry, I'm seeing some raised hands. I'm gonna be quiet and turn it over to folks who have raised hands. I'm not seeing any. Jan, can you unmute folks who have raised hands?
No, it's okay. I think people put their hands back down, so it's okay. You're good.
Okay. Okay, question.
We do have some questions in the chat that we can move to. There's one question about any suggestions for finding more diverse vendors, especially in the fine art shipping and packing arena. And can NEMA create lists of diverse vendors? Is that one way that you can find avenues for partnership?
So I don't work on the shipping side of things. So I would have to talk to our preparators and collections manager about fine art shipping and packing arena, or possibly like maybe there's a PAG group that could talk about that through NEMA. There are a lot of Black-owned business lists though. So I almost exclusively do BIPOC-owned businesses for catering, which is what we do for Black Art Matters Festival. And anytime we need an item for an event, I turn to those lists. So I'm happy to share links to some of those spreadsheets. They're specific to Western Mass, which is where we're based. But if you kind of like go to your local BLM group, Black Lives Matter group on Facebook or Instagram, I'm sure that those lists exist wherever you are. So I'd encourage you to seek those out. So maybe this is a question for my co-panelist. I'm wondering about the dichotomy of standing up for yourself and your own agency as a marginalized person versus when it's time to take a back seat.
Yeah, that's a hard one. So I would say that for the Black Arts Matters Festival, I think it was helpful to remember how it got started. The fact that, which is why I think it was important to share the history, and the fact that this came out of a student walking around campus, looking at the art, at the Mead and at the art, you know, in our hallways and our buildings, and seeing that there weren't a lot of art created by or art of Black people. And that she really started, Zoe Akata really started doing it on her own, as her own project and a residence hall, which a lot of faculty and staff don't even have access to. And so remembering that it was born out of, like, in a way, student activism helped me understand that even though I am a Black person and I consider myself an artist, and that, you know, I always want to practice self-care and think about how I can stand up for myself. And my role as a director of the MRC, I wanted to give the agency and the power to the student. And sometimes when you're really passionate about something and really excited and are really happy to make something happen, it can be easy to accidentally take over control. But I just kept having to remind myself of, like, where this started, you know, how it started. And even though it's expanding and getting bigger and we're adding in more partnerships, and the event is getting longer, that at the core of the program, it's a student program created, you know, by students for students. And so I think sometimes that really helps to think about the origins of the program or of the exhibition or the pop-up, and try to get back to the roots of how this all started. I think can be really helpful. Jan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just affirm what you said, Ebony, and I'll add, you know, what I'm hearing. I love this question because what I'm hearing is a few different things. So I'm hearing, like, when you stand up to yourself, when it's concerning issues or challenges or harm in shared identity, like it's identity that, like, or identity that you hold, versus how do you show up when you're advocating or working with folks who hold marginalized identities that you do not hold, right? I think there's like and that you show up differently, right? I think for the first point, like for me with inside of an institution, I'm thinking in two ways. I'm thinking, how do I model self-advocacy for the students who I support, right? And then on the same token, like when I self-advocate, oftentimes it's within systems or pushing against systems or policies that also affect the students who I support. Right. So, and for my colleagues who identify similarly. So so that, like, I often will say or name a thing because I know it has impact on our larger community. Right. And at the same time, I'm also nuanced to the institutional politics of when because I am not just me, I'm the director of the QRC, I have to save my political and social currency with people in power positions, right, for moments that are key for shifting, right? So I don't necessarily go out and like constantly attack or it's like it's a nuanced political game on, like, how do I show up? How do I get buy-in from folks who, you know, either don't see me or cause harm, and how do I educate them in ways that don't embarrass them, right? So that it then has negative political impacts on my work, right? On able to advocate on behalf of students, right? And so anyway, so I'm not being the clearest, I'm not articulating that totally clearly, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at, of like that difference between modeling importance to speak up and moments where, like, maybe I find a different way right? Depending on the individual and the positional power relationship I have with that person or entity, etc. As far as showing up with holding different identities, right? I mean, that's an integral part of the work that we do as the Resource Centers team on campus. Like, so it's important to like build, again, just as talking about programming and relationships between entities, it's also important to do that interpersonal work. Like, how do you be in relationship with your fellow colleagues that hold different marginalized identities? It's showing up for them interpersonally, it's showing up for them at work, in their work, right? It's making sure that if you're working collaboratively, that work is done equitably, right? And that you're able to be transparent with each other when there's harm caused or where work isn't happening equitably, right? And I think in the work of doing a particular program, it's like taking lead in leadership when a particular program or a particular initiative is centering the voices of those of different marginalized identities, but being willing to show up and do the work, right? Do that, not just the work of like your self-learning and relationship building, but also like literally doing tasks in service of that work, right? That doesn't necessarily center yourself or your voice, but like actually puts your labor towards furthering an initiative that is supporting or responding to the needs of different marginalized communities that you don't necessarily identify with, but are in accomplishment with.
Jen, would you mind switching slide? So I know we're a little bit over time, but we just want to say thank you all so much for coming. This is all of our contact information. If you want to keep talking, if you want to be thought partners, if you want to collaborate, we're down for that. So we have our email addresses. We also have like personal and professional social media. Please feel free to connect with us. Zach, I'm going to try to respond to your question about unexpected and overlooked sites in the chat, but we should also all keep talking and keep being there to support each other in this work. It doesn't happen alone. It's really hard. It's really stressful. There's a lot of crying. And it's really great to have great partners, which I'm lucky to have in Ebony and Jan. Thank you both. And in this wider group of all of you here to support each other through it. And then, you know, usually eat some food together, maybe post-COVID, we'll all get together and do that. So thank you again so much. Thank you, Scarlett. Thank you, Ebony and Jan. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Scarlett, Ebony.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you, speakers. Amazing.